Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. So, you've come up with this amazing setting with detailed backstories for all of your characters and pages worth of history for every major nation. Now, how are you going to stuff all of this information into a story that can still keep the reader's attention and focus on a few characters in the present? You could put all of those details into a codex or a wiki site, but that's not going to get much traffic, and your readers are not going to appreciate having to dig through a pile of information to get context for your stories. So what you need to do is integrate your setting into your stories by providing exposition that your audience will want to get through. Fortunately, there are several techniques that can help you do so. The text wall. As far as exposition goes, writing a text wall is like hitting the audience with a giant club. It's big, it's clumsy, it's direct, and most people don't enjoy the process. A text wall is essentially what you get when the narrator describes the setting or backstory directly to the audience without any sort of finesse or character involvement. Text walls aren't very enjoyable for the audience, especially when they interrupt your story or keep it from getting started. But there are some occasions when it's the best approach to take. For instance, if you're writing a sequel to another story, it won't make much sense for the characters to repeat to each other the things they already know and have been through, and so a direct recap to the audience could be your best option. However, it's important to keep the length of the recap down by only referencing the parts of the older stories that are relevant to the current story. And if you can, you should space out your recaps so that each part of it is as short and digestible as possible. But then there are exceptions to the rules, like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. No matter which version of the stories you look at, the Hitchhiker's Guide constantly goes on tangents about the setting that often have nothing to do with the actual story. But it manages to work because the story is a comedy without any real tension to interrupt, and the asides add to the humor. However, and this part is important, when the story tension actually does go up, the number and detail of the tangents goes down. The Foreigner. A lot of stories, especially speculative fiction stories, feature a protagonist who, through one means or another, has come from a distant land and knows nothing about the local situation. This story device allows an author to use characters to explain what's going on and explain what makes the setting different from the real world. After all, the audience is in the foreigner's shoes, and so aside from the exposition, this also helps the audience relate to the character's struggles. The one big downside to the foreigner technique, at least in my opinion, is that it gets used a lot in speculative fiction. And as a matter of fact, it's been used a lot since before science fiction or fantasy were their own genres. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court features a foreigner protagonist, and for that matter, so does Gulliver's Travels. I'm not saying you should avoid using the foreigner technique, but if you do, then you should think about how you want to put a unique spin on it so that you can set yourself apart from the crowd. The Narrative Dribble. Walls of text and foreigner characters are big moves that let you get a lot of setting details out of the way quickly. However, you can also reveal your setting through a series of smaller moments that take place whenever a character or the audience requires some additional context. I mean, not everyone knows everything about the world around them, and so there are always moments when you might need to learn something new or refresh your memory about something old. The narrative dribble is the subtlest way to expand your setting within your story, but it's also a very tricky technique to master. You need to deliver enough information to give the audience the context they need to understand what's going on, but you also need to avoid delivering so much information that your audience gets impatient or loses track of what's going on. Visual mediums have an advantage here because they can expand the setting in the background even as the story proceeds in the foreground, and you can present objects, people, and buildings that tell their own stories, whereas in text you would need to stop the story for a few paragraphs in order to describe everything. But, that being said, book readers are generally used to this kind of pacing, and so you can afford to take things a bit slower. The Knowledgeable Sage. Some topics like ancient history, foreign cultures, theoretical physics are things that the average character wouldn't know too much about, but they still might be relevant to your story. At times like these, authors can introduce characters who do know all about the topic and who can explain it to the characters and the audience in as much or as little detail as you like. This keeps the exposition within the story since the audience and the characters are learning at the same time, and you don't need a fish out of water to create an excuse. Of course, there are ways to misuse this archetype, same as every other option I'm discussing today. A knowledgeable sage character should either be a minor character the protagonists consult to get the exposition they need, or if you want to give them a bigger role, then they should do something more than just deliver exposition. The sage could act as a trainer or a mentor, for instance, or they could be wise enough to provide advice on relationships or the main conflict. The sage should also have limits to their knowledge, and they might even be wrong about a few things. The one thing you don't want is a major character whose only role in the story is to perfectly explain the setting to your audience. At that point, you might as well just give in and write a wall of text. The Talkative Villain. Having your villain explain their motivations and methods is a classic story beat that goes back well before comic books made villain monologues a standard feature. After all, while it may be a strategic blunder to tell your enemies what you're doing and how you're doing it, it's also a very human weakness to want to explain yourself, to want to tell your story. It also doesn't have to be a strategic blunder. The classic example of a villain monologue is to capture the protagonists and tell them everything right before the big climax, but there are plenty of other ways to reveal this information. Your story could switch perspectives, to follow the villain as they explain their plans to their allies. Your protagonist could happen across a private journal the villain never intended anyone to read. The protagonist and the villain could be friends before or to some extent during their conflict. The conflict could end with a court trial or a general vote rather than violence, and in that case, both sides would have a reason to present their arguments in public. If your protagonists have to forget to attack the villain or escape their restraints when the villain monologues, then you need to get more creative with your scene layout. The reverse irony twist. Dramatic irony is where the audience knows something that the characters within a story don't, and this creates a kind of tension as the audience waits for the characters to figure it out. So, what I'm calling a reverse irony twist is what happens when all of the characters know something important about the world, but the audience, and possibly a foreigner protagonist, doesn't. By keeping this information from the audience until later into the story, you can set up a twist with a very unique feel to it, one that not a lot of stories use. The Wicker Man, both the original film and the remake, feature this kind of twist. Everyone on the island knows the true nature of the human sacrifice they plan to perform, but the protagonist and the audience are completely ignorant. Because of this lack of crucial information, nothing quite makes sense, even though most of the clues seem to point in a certain direction. And then when the reveal happens, everything slots perfectly into place. What this means for setting creation is that sometimes it can be more useful to keep information from the audience than to spill all of the details at once. Storytelling without a net. Maybe you don't really care about explaining your setting to your audience. Maybe you want to write a fast-paced story that you don't want to slow down with any long descriptions or explanations. Or maybe you believe that a setting isn't something you really need to set in stone. Storytelling without a net means that you don't plan on explaining anything. You're just going to dive headlong into the story and give your audience just enough context to understand what's going on. Sometimes this approach can be confusing and alienates your audience, but sometimes it can be the perfect way to introduce someone to your setting. I would say both Star Wars: A New Hope and The Fifth Element are good examples of this approach. Star Wars casually throws out little tidbits like Womp Rats, the Kessel Run, and the Clone Wars, but because of the context, you don't have to understand what these terms mean to understand what the characters are saying. Likewise, the fifth element has a lot of alien races and future technology, but they're always presented as an analogy to something that actually exists, and so we the audience can still understand what's going on. Exposition always needs a light touch, since you're telling rather than showing, and you're veering away from the main story. However, there are ways to integrate it naturally into your story so that you can show your audience all of your hard work without boring them to death. So long as you're careful about how much information you provide and when, both you and your audience can fully enjoy your setting and your stories. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.